Thank you for that wonderful talk, Swamiji. The floor is now open to questions. And feedback forms are being circulated by our volunteers. Please fill them. If any one of you want to volunteer for our activities, please contact any of the volunteers.
Hello, sir. Hello. Hello, Swamiji. I read in one place that Swamiji is saying about Buddha, and he says that I don't accept many of his ideas, even though I respect him, and I find that Vedanta is a far grander philosophy. So my question is that, does he think that Vedanta is the grandest philosophy among all other philosophies available? And if there is something higher than Vedanta, he would have left it? Or is it that Vedanta is the ultimate truth, and if one sincerely follows it, he will see the truth himself?
Now you can hear me. That's a very good question. Swami Vivekananda said that the Buddha was the greatest man who ever lived. And whenever he spoke of Buddha, he spoke in the most glowing terms. He said, I have more respect for that man than for any other who ever lived. One man who stood up and took responsibility for himself, who didn't claim to have come from the heavens, didn't claim to have been born from the gods and so forth. He said, I'm a man among men, and I have attained to this state, and I give it for the welfare of all beings. And so Swamiji consistently always praised the Buddha. But as you said, he often qualified his statement by saying, I have the greatest love for that man, greater than any other, but not for his philosophy, he often said. So let me say a few things about that. I'll try to keep the answer short so others can ask questions also. Buddhism, outside of Vedanta, Buddhism is the field that I've studied perhaps the most. It's one that's dear to my heart also. Swamiji, first of all, yes, as I said at the conclusion of the talk, he felt that the clearest expression of the truth was found in Vedanta. But he said that he said in another place, we have no argument with the Mahayana Buddhism. He said that the Mahayana Buddhists also consider themselves Advaitavadis, which means Advaitavadis, but they use the word Advaita, same root. And he said that we have no argument with them. He did feel that the Theravada, so-called Hinayana, but that's a derogatory term, the Theravada tradition, he felt that it was philosophically very weak. The Theravada saying that the many is real and the one is unreal. There's no self to anything. There's no unity anywhere. Because Swamiji felt that, again, everything in human life, everything in human consciousness, everything in human knowledge is moving towards unity. And to deny that is denying the great truth of human experience and the greatest truth of the sages. Another problem he had with Buddhism itself in India. Again, he said that we have no argument with the Mahayana. And you'll find that some forms of Mahayana, when you read them, you feel like you're reading Advaita Vedanta, practically. But one of his problems was, he said that it was with the coming of Buddhism into India that the idea of other religions came into India. The Vedic idea was that religion is one thing, like in science. Originally in science, it's hard to imagine now, but originally in science, people didn't see a connection between geology, physics, chemistry, biology, these different inquiries. They weren't seen to be connected. But as science continued over the early centuries, people began to see connections between the different fields and how what we discover in physics, that affects what we discover about biology and so forth. And so now we accept that science is one thing, one method used in different areas, but they're all connected. So in the Vedic age with religion, the idea was that religion is one thing. People do it in different ways. But the Buddhists, not the Buddha himself, but the Buddhists after the time of Buddha, they define themselves as, we're not like you. We're not like the Hindus. We're not like the Vedikas. We don't accept the Vedas. We don't accept your rituals. We don't accept your caste. We don't accept your society. We don't accept any. We define ourselves as those who are different from you. And so they define themselves outside of the Vedic tradition. And by that, the idea of different religions arose in India. So one of the things Swamiji wanted to do was to bring India back to a Vedic perception of things. not in a narrow, nowadays the Hindutva and all of that is a very hot topic in India. So I'm not talking Hindutva and all of that. But I'm saying that in a broad sense, Swamiji accepted the whole of India's past, including its Buddhist, its Muslim, Mughal, its British, all of that. He accepted the whole of it. But he felt that the unifying principles of, or the Vedas were the unifying principles of Indian civilization, including that diversity of different religions within India now. And one of the ideas that he wanted to bring back was that Vedic idea that religion is one thing. They're not different religions. There's religion, and people do it in different ways. You want to do it that way? Then you do it that way. You want to do it that way? That's fine. I want to do it this way, I'll do it this way. But religion is one search. So that's just one example of the harm that Swamiji felt that Buddhism had done to India. Not intentionally by the Buddha, but by the way that the Buddhists interpreted themselves outside of the fold. There was nothing in the teachings of the Buddha that could not have been accepted within the larger tradition. You find Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, they're all quite distinct. And nothing in Buddhism is more radical than those four systems, or the Mimamsakas, who are even more radical than the Buddhists. But they were all found room within the single tradition. And so he felt that the tragedy of Indian civilization with regard to Buddhism was the splitting of those two.
Thank you, Swamiji, for the lecture.
Yes.
And before I pose my question, deeply inspired by your admiration and respect for the civilization that India stands for, having been born in a different cultural scenario. My question is basically more practical than spiritual. When we talk about different levels of truth.
Different levels of?
Truth. Different levels of truth. Then in today's scenario, as you said, Hindutva is a big topic, so we don't touch it, right? So one of the main arguments posed against the whole idea of different levels of truth is, how do you categorize which is the higher level and which is the lower level? And even though someone is in full agreement with the whole metaphysics of Vedanta, it might not be socially possible for a person to really transcend the practical limitations of the religion as we know it today and accept it, right? So how do we grapple with this issue?
Yes. Well, first, the idea of levels of truths. The basic principle about what is a higher level and what is a lower level is that a level which explains both itself as well as the previous levels is considered a higher level. If there's a level which explains itself, but it doesn't explain the higher, and I'll give an example in a moment, then it's considered lower. If there's another level of truth that explains itself, but everything that came before it also, that's considered higher because it's more comprehensive. Just as in science, if you have an idea that explains a single phenomenon, that's good. You've got some understanding of a single phenomenon. But if you find a principle, a law, a principle that explains this in terms of a large variety, then you find that, this is a higher truth because it explains much more. It explains this, but also in context with all of this. So, for instance, as Swami Vivekananda taught, and admittedly not everyone will accept that, and that's okay, but he did teach that Dvaita, dualism, Vishishtadvaita, qualified monism, and Advaita are stages on a ladder of experience. That Advaita is the highest because in terms of Advaita you can explain the other two. Whereas from the standpoint of Dvaita, that is that I'm completely separate from God, it explains itself, it has its own philosophy, but it doesn't accept either Vishishtadvaita or Advaita. It just accepts itself and just explains itself. But if you go to Vishishtadvaita, which says that I'm a part of God, I belong to God, I'm of the same nature, but I'm Anu, whereas God is Vibhu, great. Then that can, in terms of Vishishtadvaita, you can understand Dvaita philosophy quite well. But you can also understand Vishishtadvaita. But if you go to the Advaita, which says that there's one non-dual reality, out of which all of this is a manifestation, then you can see that, no, Vishishtadvaita also has its true standpoint. Dvaita also has its true standpoint. but Advaita also is true. And so that is considered a principle of the more comprehensive is the higher. If you take something that in the realm of modern physics, that the Newtonian laws of physics we still study in school. When we study physics, we still study Newtonian, the gravitational equation and so forth, and his ideas of thermodynamics and so forth. We study that, but we accept that the theory of relativity is a higher explanation. Why? Because it explains things that Newton's laws don't explain. When you come to the vast, the cosmic, then you find that Newtonian physics is not sufficient to explain that, whereas Einsteinian physics does, at least to a large extent, explain it. So with quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, we find that there Newtonian physics breaks down. But in terms of quantum mechanics, you can still understand Newtonian physics. You don't have to deny it. And so the more comprehensive is considered the higher. And again, a dualist is not going to accept that Vishishtadvaita and Advaita are true to begin with, so there's no argument. And that's okay, let them have it. But the position of the Swami was that Advaita is the highest because it explains the most. And now I've forgotten the second part of your question, which was the larger part, I think. Can you rephrase that?
The second part of my question was, even if there are indeed different levels and one is higher than the other, how does an individual in the sense of, as we understand it, social individual, okay, how does he accept it given social constraints exist in the world that we live, right, which maybe prevent him from openly, submitting himself to the truth per se?
Yes, that's also a very good question and a practical question that many people have to face. On a small scale, is something that many of our people in the West, devotees of the Vedanta tradition, for instance, in the West have to face practically every day. Again, in the small scale, it may be that a husband or a wife falls in love with Vedanta, they're following it, and their partner in life is a conservative, committed Christian or Jew who doesn't like their involvement in Vedanta. And so they have to find some sort of compromise so that they don't break up the family because of their religious conviction. And so that's on a small scale. And then there can be a larger scale where a member of a community, he likes certain principles but finds that all of those around him in the larger society don't accept what he believes, and he finds that he has to be quiet in order not to get himself or his family into trouble. So yes, these are practical problems. The general solution for that kind of conflict is that no one can stop you from the internal search. Now, if you want to express, that's where the problem comes. If you want to express, and that's a natural human desire, to want to, that which is within me, I want to express and to show to others and to share with others. And that is what such conflicts prevent. But as far as the search itself, no one can stop me from the inner search because it's internal. And no one has access or control over my internal processes. They may control my body, they may control my expression, but they can't control my internal search. I was recently in Iran. I was invited to Iran by the government and by a university, the University of Religions, plural, religions and denominations in the holy city of Qom in Iran. A wonderful new university which teaches Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, as well as other religions, Christianity, different forms of Islam, and so forth. It's not much liked by the conservative government in Iran, but the government funds it, gives money for it to operate, and it operates very, very well. Wonderful library with books of Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna, as well as many other Hindu traditions. So there I met many people who are in a society which is very conservative, a conservative government, and a government which is afraid of any sort of movement, even within Islam. It doesn't have to be outside of Islam. Even within Islam, they're afraid of movements because they're afraid that if too many people come together, it's dangerous for the stability of the government. They feel threatened. And so many people, their expression is greatly curbed. And yet there I found that the spiritual life in Iran, that there's quite flourishing there. Again, because no one can control one's inner consciousness. And so one, if they have access to the ideas and the teachings, they can apply them internally. And you find people with a deep spiritual hunger and a spiritual life in Iran, in spite of external constraints. You see in the Soviet Union, during the days of the Soviet Union and Russia, when religion was officially suppressed in the country, that there were many people who had a very vibrant spiritual life. Not a majority, but there were people who had a vibrant spiritual life in spite of extraordinary external pressures not to be religious and a ban on any sort of exhibition of religiosity. And so, sometimes because of external circumstances and social circumstances, we have to, just for practical concerns, we have to be careful how we express. But we can still carry on the search inside. I met a wonderful young woman in Iran, among many people I met there and talked to, a wonderful young woman there, who said that I'm always in trouble because I'm a rebel by nature. And I'm religious, I'm spiritual, I'm on a spiritual search, but I don't do things in the accustomed way. And so I'm always in conflict with my culture, with my people, because they want everything. The government is very conservative, and the society is afraid of people doing things that are not in the norm because you may get in trouble with the government. So she said, I'm always in conflict. But I saw that even with her, that there was this internal search was going on. And she found also ways of expressing herself externally within limitations. So sometimes that's a practical problem we have to face, and we have to face it the best that we can. Now, I don't know if that addressed your question. If it didn't, please amplify.
It more or less did, but let me be very direct. At the very beginning of your lecture, you had mentioned that in particular academic environments like the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where people are trained in the very Western way of thinking, not just Marxism or the theories on the right, but generally. They tend to interpret words in their own paradigm. For example, when I use the word higher or lower, they take it in the literal meaning, right? Which then again becomes offensive. And I place that in the context of the Hindutva debate that is going on, right? So how do we address this problem, this practical problem for believers of Vedanta who meet with this kind of brick wall they cannot cross, right, in the current society? Now, does this require a change in the very vocabulary that we use?
That's a very good question, and that is a little different from what I was addressing. I didn't understand that. That's a very good question, and one that's very pertinent to life in India right now. Because there are in India, as in the West, there are many hot topics that you don't dare touch because they're too hot, and in India, there are a different set of hot topics that people are afraid to touch because they're so hot. And so, yes, one thing to do is to try to find a vocabulary that works. When you find a stiff wall of resistance, then you try again, just as with your internal life, if you find that in your meditative life that you're not going forward, you try to find some way to get around the obstacle, internal obstacle. So with external society, when you find that what you're saying is meeting a brick wall of misunderstanding and misrepresentation, then you try to find a way to get around the wall. Try to formulate it in a different way that doesn't raise the same obstacles. Now sometimes, one of the facts you find, and I've seen it here in India, I've seen it in the West, you find it everywhere now, when people have become so hypersensitive to many issues, there are people who want to misunderstand and are determined to misunderstand, no matter what you say or no matter how you frame it. They're determined that if they catch any hint that you're speaking from a spiritual standpoint, then that's enough already to raise a wall of misunderstanding. So someone who wants to misunderstand and is determined to misunderstand, you just have to realize that this is what I'm dealing with, and not much is going to work. But what will work is if you find someone who has concerns, has resistance, but they're willing to listen, they're willing to consider if you change the framing of your statements, then you can get through to them. For instance, a person who is a committed Marxist, but they are not a dogmatic Marxist. They're Marxist because they find that the principles are true to them and to society and so forth. With such a person, you can always find a way to dialogue. But with someone who is out to prove that religion is wrong no matter what you say, then the dialogue itself is not going to do much. So you have to sort of judge what you're dealing with and then try to adjust your framing of the topic to find a way around the obstacles. Like the same thing you said about such people who have a problem with the very idea of higher and lower. They consider that a judgment which is unwarranted at any level. That we face in the West also. And so you have to find a way to speak not in terms of a ladder of experience or something, but something which is less challenging to that prejudgment that they have.
Pranam Swamiji. Swamiji, I have a question.
Yes.
Science and spirituality both are essentially quest for knowledge. So I have two questions here. The first question is there a point where science and spirituality will probably meet in the future? Can we say that science and spirituality will yield the same knowledge? That is my first question. Second thing is, science is more of an external search. People conduct experiments and data, we get data, and it's something that anybody can verify. But spirituality, on the other hand, is more of an internal search. So people, like every individual needs to conduct the search by himself. So is it possible to impose or not impose, is it possible to have common laws for spirituality, just like how we have common laws for science? Because in the case of science, it's a lot easier to verify. But in the case of spirituality, it's more of an individual thing. So how do we do it?
Yes, well, first, and I'll try not to forget the second part of the question. Let me go to the first part first, and that is, will science and religion meet? Swami Vivekananda was convinced that they will. And time will show whether he was right or whether he was wrong. That we still don't know. Those of us who love Swamiji feel that naturally that whatever Swamiji said is going to happen, but that's a matter of faith. That's a question. So time will tell whether they come together. But his reason for believing that they would come together is that both are searches for truth, and both have behind them a sense of integrity about truth. That true religion, as Swami Vivekananda defined religion, it didn't mean just going to a temple or to a mosque or to a church and just going through the rigmarole, but it meant a search for that which transcends the senses. So true religion has an integrity about the search. Science has an integrity. And science, there are certain laws, as you say, which protect the integrity of science. And when those laws are not followed and when they're not adhered to, you find the great public embarrassments of science when they find that some hoax has been perpetrated by a scientist, like the famous case, the very old case of the Piltdown man, and things like that. And there are much more recent cases of hoaxes that have been perpetrated because someone wanted to get ahead with the research and they falsified it. And so in both, there's a sense of integrity that has to be maintained. So first, let me come back and say why the two would meet. Because both are searches with integrity for truth. One, as you said, going outward, the scientific, what is this? What is this? How to understand it? And the other going inside, who am I? Who am I? What is the deepest core of my being? That's what I'm going to deal with tomorrow in the talk here. So the two searches are looking for truth in different directions. But the reason he believed that they would come together is that ultimately we find that the distinction between outside and inside is wrong. That there is no ultimate distinction between outside and inside. What does outside and inside mean? It means outside of my body and inside of my body, within my mind. But what do we find? This I'll deal with tomorrow. It's one of the central topics tomorrow, so I won't do the whole thing now. But just very briefly, we discover that the whole universe of my experience is inside my mind, that there's not an outside and inside. When I perceive the world out there, say from just taking one sense, the sense of vision, the light falls on the retina, a coded message is sent by the receptors in the retina along the optic nerve, and a picture is not sent in the optic nerve, a nervous message is sent, a coded message, up to the center in the brain. The brain recreates it, and one thing it does is it turns the picture upside down because the picture on the retina is upside down. What I'm seeing is not out there. What I'm seeing is the mind's recreation. And so I'm seeing inside my own mind. I can't see outside of my own mind. So anyway, that's one small way of saying that eventually we find that the distinction between inside and outside is not true. It's false. And so eventually science and religion have to come together when they come to a point deep enough where science also discovers that, we're really looking at the same thing from a different perspective. And one more thing about that, Swami Vivekananda felt that science would begin to realize that when they found that now we've come to an understanding of the connection between matter and energy through Einstein and his E equals mc squared and other ideas, which we've understood to bring energy and matter together into one thing manifesting into two ways. But Swamiji felt that there was a higher unity that would lead to. That would lead to the level of mind, that matter and energy are two manifestations which are coming out of mind. And that I can only present as a theory now, and Swamiji presented as a theory, but for himself, he claimed that was a matter of experience, direct experience. And many sages have done the same. So you can believe them or not believe them, but that's their claim. So that science, when it comes to look for the what's behind matter and energy, to go deeply into them, then they'll begin to find the indications of something mental rather than physical. And just to conclude with that part of your question, that was when I was 13 years old, I read a book called The Universe and Dr. Einstein by Lincoln Barnett, which at that time, this was way back in the 60s, early 60s, popularization of Einstein's ideas. And in that book it said that modern physics has begun to prove the idea of the idealist philosophers, that this universe is more mental than physical. This was way back in the early 1960s, and it was written in the 1950s, that the modern physics is showing that the universe is more mental than physical. And so that's what Swamiji meant when he said that eventually science will have to come to a point where it says it can't understand the physical universe in isolation from the mind that experiences it. And then it'll find that there's a higher unity out of which the physical universe is coming, and that's a mental universe. I know just one a conclusion on the second part of your question. Will religion need to formulate some laws or something to enforce a sort of integrity? Swamiji didn't speak in terms of rules and regulations and sort of external structures to protect that. But he did believe that religion would have to become and needed to become more scientific, more rigorous, and less prone to superstition. One thing you find it plentifully in the West now, when many people have taken up an interest in Eastern religion and so forth, and any type of religion, including even physicists. You find that anything that, no matter how bizarre, people are willing to believe. But that's not true spirituality. That's just the gullibility of the human mind, whether it's in science or in religion. And so in religion, we have to always have a sense of sincerity, a sense of integrity, a sense of dedication to the truth, so that we don't just believe whatever pops into the mind or whatever anybody says just because they said it. So again, I don't know about external controls. That's difficult to enforce or whatever on an internal search. But certainly there has to be a sense of integrity, a sense of sincerity, and a sense of wanting truth and not superstition.
We'll have one last question.
Yeah.
Namaste, Swamiji. Thanks for the talk. Swamiji,
Excuse me, wait.
he took the mic first.
No, he can ask.
Well, I'll try to answer very quickly, so if possible, we'll have 2 questions. But I'll try. Let's see.
Namaste, Swamiji. As we know, there is law of gravitation.
As long as there's...
As we know, there is law of gravitation.
Yes.
We are, even if I don't know Newton, I know I'm able to stand. Then I know Newton. Oh, yes, okay, he said there is law of gravitation, and therefore I'm able to stand. So similarly, there is law of magnetism. So I read and I can experience it very simply. It is just a time span of minutes so that I can understand, yes, that there is law of gravitation. So similarly, with the law of oneness, so if I want to understand that here all is one, there is only one consciousness present here. If I want to understand law of karma, so is it possible to understand this law of oneness or law of karma while studying here in this environment, or what methods we have to use?
Yes, it is possible. It is possible. But there's a basic difference between understanding something like gravity, which we feel physically, and understanding something like the law of karma, or understanding the unity of all existence, because those are more subtle matters. Everybody has at least physical awareness, and we're all aware that I'm not floating up into the air. When the earth is holding me, and so gravitation explains why the earth is holding me. So that's very easy to understand because it's at a physical level. But the higher we go, to the mental level, to the moral level, to the spiritual level, those are also functioning right now in our experience, but they're harder to see because we're not used to thinking at that level. We're used to dealing with the physical. And this is easy to understand because it's something that we deal with day in and day out. But as soon as I go to something which is more internal, more subtle, more mental, then it becomes harder to perceive the functioning of it. But that just means a little harder. It doesn't mean impossible. It's all of those principles are quite understandable and quite perceptible. They're experiential. They're not theories. They're not dogmas and so forth. Not just nice ideas, but they are experiential. It's just that the higher the level of experience we go to, it takes more time before we begin to experience it because we're not used to looking there. So like we can look out at the stars and see these little lights all over the sky, but when we study astrophysics, we find that's much harder than to understand the simple principle of gravity, because I deal with gravity every day. But the nature of the stars are far away from me, and the principles are more outside of my ordinary experience. They can be verified, but they're harder to experience. So the same with spiritual things. They're more subtle.
This is Swamiji, if I could squeeze in a last question. Let me start out with the fact that science talks about the concept of entropy, in the sense that the universe is moving towards a more random universe as we go along. And you talked about the fact that everything comes back to unity. So my question is there a contradiction?
No, there's not a contradiction, because the universe, the universe falling into entropy, that's at the physical level, and it's believed in there. It's a ancient belief, and this is one that's more difficult to prove. But an ancient belief that the universe goes through cycles of creation and dissolution, creation and dissolution. And so dissolution can be seen in one way as the principle of entropy, that when entropy finally takes over, that's what happens. And Swami Vivekananda said that sameness here at level of manifestation, sameness is death. Sameness is death. That means, sameness here means entropy, when everything just sort of falls into a soup of sameness, when things cannot maintain their integrity. And so at the physical level, entropy takes over. But at the level of consciousness, that's where unity is experienced. And even entropy, when everything becomes one cosmic soup, undifferentiated cosmic soup without any vitality and so forth, that also is still the same ocean of matter, just in a different form of the ocean of matter. And that ocean of matter still exists within consciousness. And so consciousness itself is not subject to entropy. Our mind is subject to entropy. The body is subject to entropy, but consciousness is not subject to entropy. And so if we can reach the experience of consciousness, then even what happens to the mind doesn't matter. And tomorrow, if there's time in the talk on the search for the self, I'll tell a story which illustrates that.
Thank you, Swamiji. Now, I would like to invite Dharmesh to deliver the vote of thanks.
We have come to the end of an inspiring and enlightening lecture. On behalf of Vivekananda Study Circle, I extend my heartiest thanks to our speaker, Swami Atmarupanandaji. We ever remain grateful to Swami Atmashraddhanandaji, who has been a continuous source of inspiration and guidance for all our activities. We thank Professor C. Balaji of Mechanical Department for guiding our VSC through all our activities. Thanks are due to Director Professor Bhaskar Ram Murthy and the Dean of Students. I also thank Dean ICSR for providing this venue. We are grateful to CEC for providing video coverage for this lecture. Finally, I thank all the volunteers of VSC, past and present, for working selflessly to continue the good work. I thank all of you for being a wonderful audience and for making this program a success. Thank you.
We shall conclude this evening with Shanti Mantra recital by our volunteers.
Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.